Hi, students and followers. Today we are going to talk about metrics. The first question which we actually have to ask us is, why do we actually need to have metrics? We need to have metrics due to that if it's not measured, thus it cannot be managed. We also need them because what gets measured also gets done. We also need them that if you really understand anything or something fully, it must be measured. Without good metrics, i.e. something being measured, we just make qualified guesses. And finally, we have to keep in mind that all metrics actually require a baseline, a reference point for measurement, interpretation, and reporting. There are 7 different classes of metrics. We have quantitative metrics, practical metrics, directional metrics, actionable metrics, financial metrics, and especially in projects we have milestone metrics and end result or success metrics. So how many metrics do we actually have to choose? If we choose too many, this will steal time for other work activities. It will also provide too much information, will confuse stakeholders, colleagues. But there is huge risk also that the information collected is out of limited value. On the other hand, if we choose too few, we will not have enough critical information, and we will also have difficulties when it comes to making decisions. So talking about metrics, there are 3 different classes or categories of metrics. As first, we have the result indicators. Then we have the performance indicators. And finally, we have the KPIs or key performance indicators. So I will actually focus on the last one, key performance indicators. KPI stands for key, a major contributor to the success, or in some some cases also failure. Performance implies that it can be measured, quantified, adjusted, or controlled. And finally, indicator. That should indicate future performance in some kind of way. Along with the definition of KPIs, there are 11 different characteristics. A KPI must be aligned, owned, predictable, actionable, few in numbers. That relates to the question how many should actually be selected, but also easy to understand. They also need to be balanced, i.e. each KPI should balance or reinforce each other, being linked to each other. It should also trigger changes. They should be standardized in order to facilitate understanding, but also calculations. They should be context-driven and finally relevant. When we are identifying KPI, we can actually use the SMART model, which stands for specific. This implies that the KPI needs to be specific and clear. when it comes to measurements of performance and business purpose, according to the business purpose. Measurable, of course. The KPI must be measurable in some kind of way. It should also be attainable, i.e. the targets are reasonable and achievable, linked to the selected KPI. Realistic or relevant. And finally, time-based. The KPI must be measurable within a certain given amount of time, i.e. not take too much time to measure. There are three main guidelines or consideration which you have to consider. First, the general one. General guidelines in selection of KPIs. I.e. make sure that the metrics are worth collecting, but also that it is used and that it is informative. Of course, that it has to be measurable, and also that implies that you have to train perhaps your co-workers in the use of and measurement of the KPI. The second guideline considers costs. Please consider the cost involved in performing the measurement of a KPI, i.e. frequency of measurements, the amount of measurement needed, etc. Because this costs time and thus also money. And the final guideline in the selection of KPIs relates to that every KPI has to be revised. And you can either choose to update the metric itself, or leave the metric, or just retire the use of the metric. Do not use it any longer. Finally, I will just present some examples of KPIs used in project management. Here we find, for example, the percentage of work package adhering to the schedule, or why not to the budget. The number of assigned resources versus planned resources. That comes down to the planning of the project. We also find time to achieve value. Percent of critical assumptions changed during the project period. Number of cost revisions. And finally, number of critical constraints changes, scope of changes, or schedule revisions. And by saying this, I will thank you for listening, and the end. See you. Bye.